Perfect. Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Our first speaker this semester in the Brain Aging Talk series sponsored by TALC is Dr. Sid O'Brien. He is the Executive Director of the Institute for Translational Research at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. Overall, the center takes a precision medicine approach towards managing different neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. And Dr. O'Brien's impressive research has been featured in several top-tier journals and is funded by several NIH grants that emphasize novel approaches for disease detection and screening into clinical trials. Truly a pioneer in the field, Dr. O'Brien leads the longitudinal health and aging brain study, Health Disparities, which focuses on understanding the biological, social, and environmental factors that influence cognitive and brain aging in ethnically and racially diverse communities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And in this project, extremely large cohorts of Mexican American, Black, and non-Hispanic whites have been recruited from the community. So this project really reflects data that's been lacking in the field, and the importance of such a contribution really cannot be overstated, as it is one of a kind. We're really excited to learn more about the results from this exciting project today. So with that, Dr. O'Brien, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. That's a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's nice to be virtually here with all of you. Definitely going to have to come down to Austin and come see what all of you are doing. It's interesting to be on this talk today because of some of the, I know many of you on there, and it always makes me nervous to speak when Robin's around because she was actually one of my mentors. And so I never want to disappoint. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that for me is very important. My very first research study was actually under Dr. Hilsebeck's guidance, looking at racial impacts on cognitive testing, specifically facial memory testing. And so I've been studying cross-cultural issues in neuropsychology and dementia for a very long time, as well as biomarkers, especially blood-based. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the HABS-HD study. Before we get into it, there's the disclosures. We have numerous NIH grants, as well as been funding from multiple foundations. There's numerous patents and stuff that have been developed over the years. This is the most important slide that I will show you today. I don't really do anything. My team does a ton. And I believe I have the best team on the planet. This is always difficult to actually provide because it's a large team, and I'm looking at it now realizing we have new people that aren't listed. So but this is the people who actually do the work. Okay, so why study Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's related dementias across diverse communities? Why is this even, why is this the focus of my entire career, basically? Well, what a lot of people are at least now starting to know and learn is that African Americans currently suffer the largest burden of Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's related dementias of any racial and ethnic group in the United States. Additionally, Hispanics will share the greatest increase, burden over the next several decades. Despite those facts, over 90% of individuals enrolled in research in Alzheimer's disease have been from diverse communities, less than 5% of those enrolled in clinical trials. Yet, in 2018, there was the release of the ATN framework. And sometimes I forget to put a slide specifically on what the ATN framework is, so I'll explain it very briefly. The ATN framework was generated with the explicit goal of creating the first fully biological conceptualization of Alzheimer's disease, with the explicit goal of advancing novel trials. So the whole point of the ATN framework is clinical trials. This is not a clinical framework, it's research framework. And most amyloid is now regulatory approved, not reimbursed, and there is now a TALC tracer that's approved. But the ATN framework is not implemented clinically unless you're in a very highly specialized clinic setting, because most don't have access to the technologies. So our point and goal of the study was to fill this gap. What does the ATN framework look like? That's amyloid, the amyloid plaques that you can do on PET scan. You can find amyloid, you can do lumbar punctures, etc. T is tau, and then N is neurodegeneration. So we use PET scans and MRI. So the reason we do PET scans is our focus groups suggested that less than 10% of individuals would be willing to do lumbar punctures without significant education aspect to it. And actually the follow-up that the group did after that was every single person who agreed, that said would do a lumbar puncture, was interviewed personally by me. And all of them then went back to the team and said, we only said yes because it was Dr. O'Brien. We really don't want to do that. So we had almost a 100% refusal rate. So we are actually going to try and build the educational materials to do this, but that's not what we're doing yet. Okay. What are the demographic projections of the United States? Well, as you can see from this slide, and there's many other ones out there you can find, but the number of African Americans and Hispanics in the United States is going to grow pretty significantly by 2060, whereas the percentage of non-Hispanic whites actually decreases. And so over 50% of the population of the United States will be non-white in a very short time frame. So, but why Dallas-Fort Worth? Well, Dallas-Fort Worth actually currently reflects the racial and ethnic distribution of where the United States will be by 2045. We're already there. And so it turns out the community here is very diverse and already reflective of where, like I said, the rest of this country will be. It's also the 7th largest metropolitan area in the United States. So there's large numbers of people here. There's over 7 million people. So it's really an ideal location to do a study like this. It's sometimes a little unique to see studies this large single site, but not. Framingham is a very similar design study to what we're doing. As a matter of fact, the offspring study recruitment of Framingham, the Omni cohort 1 and 2, are completely community-based recruitment, and Framingham actually began as a community-based study. So I keep going too far. My mouse is really, all right. So here's brief overview of the study itself. We have already enrolled over 1,000 Mexican Americans. We've enrolled over 1,000 non-Hispanic whites. We began the recruitment of African Americans around a year ago, a little bit over that. So right in the middle of COVID, which was great. We are now over 50% through visit 2 for the Mexican American and non-Hispanic white participants, but we actually have enrolled half of the African American cohort already. We're over 500. We do plan for 24-month intervals, but obviously COVID impacts that. But our also general philosophy is that once someone's enrolled in the study, they're never removed unless I personally actually am the only person who has the authority to remove someone from the study. And that's only done if we feel that being in the study is detrimental to the participant themselves. So people can wait. They can wait 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They're still welcome to come back. Baseline data is already available for 1,705 participants. There's a link there, and I try to do this early and late, is this data is publicly available to everybody. As a matter of fact, Dr. Clark's group has requested in numerous data requests, and they have data. Use it, please go after it. So what's in the database? We do a functional exam. We used to do medical, what we call the medical, basically a brief H&P and neuro exam. But when you're seeing is this many people, we had to transition more to an epi approach. So we do a functional exam. Everyone gets clinical labs, a lot of sociocultural, environmental, and behavioral in the interview. We do neuropsychological testing. Everything's item level data in the database. So the database is rather large. We have That's actually, we actually have over 500,000 aliquots of blood now in the freezers. We collect serum plasma and Buffy coats on every participant. We have actually over, I think, a 98% agreement rate to the biorepository. We've done MRI scans since the initial funding. We received follow-up funding to add amyloid and tau PET scans. And so we're now collecting that data. The next data release is 5/1, and so we've actually conducted over 1,200 amyloid PET scans in less than 12 months. So the team's moving pretty rapidly on that. This is just one slice of the data because said it's a longitudinal, so it changes rapidly, but there's over 1,000 participants among two of the groups already. This is a community-based study and age 50 and above. So we went younger because we really, truly believe that we have to go a lot younger. And as a matter of fact, if the renewal is funded, we will add 1,500 new participants to the study aged 30 to 49. So we're trying to do as much of a life course perspective as we can. Being a community-based study, the base rates of MCI and dementia will be what we see in this cohort. We don't recruit from clinics. And so the base rates are where we actually would expect them for the age range. Okay, so what really kind of started this journey? Back in 2013, our team, we published this work, and what we found was looking at just community-based and clinic-based enrollment of participants. And what we found was age of MCI, mild cognitive impairment, clinically defined, was substantially younger among Mexican Americans as compared to non-Hispanic whites, as you can see here. We've now cross-validated that in the cohort, in the HD cohort. And so we've seen this multiple times. And that got us asking some pretty interesting questions as why? Why is it that we would see this younger age of onset of cognitive loss? And initially, what a lot of people thought, I'm a neuropsychologist by training, many of you on this Zoom are neuropsychologists, is was there bias in the testing? Was it just a systematic bias that people were getting diagnosed at younger ages? What was it? Given that we have created population group specific norms, and the fact that our consensus review contains people who have been doing this for so long, we didn't think that was the case. But we still want to dig into it. And so where I started, one of the first questions that I had was, okay, younger age of onset, what's going on with ApoE4? So number one genetic risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease. Well, our first look at this again in 2013 was ApoE4 was less prevalent among Mexican Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites. In the same year, that was actually independently published by a different group. And then a year or two later, Hector Gonzalez found similar things where Mexican Americans had lower rates of ApoE4 positivity compared to other Hispanic groups within the Sol Inca study. We have now found the same thing in the HD cohort. And I should say, so ABLE was the name of the study. The original name of the study has always been Health and Aging Brain Study, but because we were focused on recruitment of Mexican Americans, ABLE, Health and Aging Brain among Latino elders, was the targeted outreach component. But since we've expanded the study, we also went back to the original name to better reflect the community with which we serve. So ApoE4, so younger age of onset of MCI, less prevalent ApoE4 positivity. We've now cross-validated that, like I said, in HD. And we've also found a couple other things. And so specifically, there's a large literature looking at ApoE4 and cognitive outcomes. And ApoE4 is normally related to memory as well as executive functioning outcomes. But in our cohort, that's what we found among non-Hispanic whites, but among Mexican Americans, really memory. ApoE4 was specifically associated with memory outcomes and nothing else. So again, younger age of onset, lower rates of ApoE4, but when ApoE4 is present, it is specifically risk for poor memory. Okay, So what about other genetics? And so we have now done GWAS among approximately 800 Mexican Americans, 800 non-Hispanic whites. And one of the things I was curious about, and the group has started looking at, none of this is published yet, they took several of the top markers from the Kunkel article. You can find them wherever there's several out there. And we just wanted to know, what's the prevalence of the risk allele, and does it vary? And from what you see on this slide is basically all of the top genetic risks vary by race and ethnicity. We're not the first team to find this. There's numerous other studies out there looking at how specific genetic markers are associated with risk. So, okay. Next question then, all right, so what about amyloid? So because the ATN framework came out, many of you may or may not know, by the framework definition, amyloid is Alzheimer's disease from a research standpoint. If there's no amyloid presence, it's not Alzheimer's disease. It is not only sufficient but necessary. You must see amyloid to classify Alzheimer's. You can have the absence of tau and the absence of neurodegeneration. So what we did was said, all right, what's just the prevalence rates of amyloid positivity? So clinically, someone reads it, or an SUVR cut score. What we found was amyloid positivity rates were lower among Mexican Americans, regardless of what diagnostic category you looked at. So it could just be overall amyloid positivity or amyloid positivity among MCI, not cognitively unimpaired, or those with dementia. And in our study, the dementia is clinically defined Alzheimer's disease. I mean, this is a community-based study, so there will be people with other things, but clinically, that's what most of them look like. And what you see here is it's not just lower among Mexican Americans, but we're also finding lower rates of amyloid positivity among African Americans. We've not only found this in the HD study, but an independent primary care-based study that we're wrapping up now, also lower rates of amyloid positivity. Dr. Robert Rissman and I have a R01 looking at plasma blood-based biomarkers of Alzheimer's in the A4 clinical trial, prevention trial samples. And we analyzed this data and found the same thing there. These are cognitively unimpaired older adults. And amyloid positivity is lower. And this has been published by, somebody looked at it and published it recently. They didn't look at the Hispanic data, just African American. So we find younger age of onset, absence of ApoE4 or lower rates, but ApoE4 is relevant when they're lower rates of amyloid. So if ApoE4 is associated with memory specific, it's important when there, but not as prevalent. Is it also related to amyloid pathology? So this is an article that was just accepted for publication. I think it's in Frontiers of Neurology. I actually have to edit the proofs. But this is, I mean, to me, this is a small scale study, 149 non-Hispanic whites, 105 Mexican Americans. That may be one of the largest PET scan studies with Mexican Americans actually ever published. So we have obviously more scans than that, but we don't have the data in the database yet. But what you can see here is amyloid. So ApoE4 positivity is associated with amyloid among both groups. Statistically significant. Look at the amount of variance accounted for, though. So yes, ApoE4 is important. It's associated with amyloid, but the link between ApoE4 and amyloid, even though significant in both groups, is stronger among non-Hispanic whites. And depending on how much data I get through, that is a theme you're going to see in this work. I have way more data than I can actually cover in this time frame, so I'm going to go through as much as I can. So one of the things that we've been very interested in is, okay, we have lower rates of amyloid, lower rates of ApoE4 positivity, increased risk for dementia. what is this, right? And so what are the other factors that might be contributing to increased risk of what clinically looks like Alzheimer's disease, but might not be Alzheimer's disease? As you saw from the prior slide, 50% of those people that clinically look like Alzheimer's disease are not amyloid positive, which means by current definition of ATN framework, research framework, they don't have Alzheimer's disease. So this is a small scale pilot study that is in press. I don't remember where I would tell you. And what we found, we looked at metabolic factors, and glucagon and insulin were both associated with amyloid burden among Mexican Americans, but non-Hispanic whites. And so there's an inconsistent literature about the link between peripheral metabolic functioning and markers and amyloid burden. And that's probably because the vast majority of people enrolled in the large scale Alzheimer's studies, one, are non-Hispanic white primarily, so lower rates of diabetes, but two, oftentimes studies exclude for common medical comorbidities, which we do not. So we have a much broader range of these things. So that's amyloid. So we went back and said, okay, younger age of onset of mild cognitive impairment. What about neurodegeneration? So this is neurodegeneration as defined by the JACC Meta ROI. It's a 2019 article, and it's just an aggregate measure of atrophy across key regions of interest that are associated with Alzheimer's. There's also what's called the Alzheimer's cortical signature. There's other things you can look at, but this is what we selected. Well, younger age of onset of neurodegeneration. And that was something that was a little bit of a surprise to me. Because of what we were seeing with APOE4, et cetera. So what we're finding is that there's something biologically going on in the brain at younger ages. Although the percent of positivity is a little bit lower, but not really drastic. But that age difference is very, very interesting and difficult to deal with and explain. And so we wanted to dig further into neurodegeneration because many of us believe that that actually may be one of the early factors. But even the ATN framework itself, I view neurodegeneration, whether it's MRI or NFL, like trails B of neuropsych, right? It's sensitive to everything, but it's not specific to anything. So it tells you something's going on, but it really does not tell you anything about pathology. And so what we looked at and what we found was, this is in press now at Alzheimer's and Dementia. And what we found was, as you can see here, that sociocultural factors were associated significantly with neurodegeneration. And when we split out by ethnicity, this was being driven by the Mexican American cohort. And so, there's something going on about underlying medical comorbidities, but also sociocultural factors that are impacting these ATN outcomes. Okay, so one of the things my team and I personally have been doing for a very long time is blood-based biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. And so what we wanted to know is, are these peripheral blood biomarkers associated with neurodegeneration? And the answer that we found using AI/ML-based methods, this is support vector machine analyses, yes. As a matter of fact, we use, as you can see, clinical labs in this too, not just proteomics. So yes, you can find a blood-based biomarker profile of neurodegeneration, but the biomarker profile itself is pretty different. And so the relative importance of these markers changes. But interestingly enough, what I don't show here is we've created a blood-based biomarker profile of Alzheimer's and MCI among Mexican Americans as compared to non-Hispanic whites. And in those analyses, the plasma-based ATN markers of amyloid, tau, neurodegeneration don't weigh in the top half of markers really for MCI or dementia among Mexican Americans. They do for non-Hispanic whites. But for neurodegeneration, what you see among both groups, NFL, A beta 40, A beta 42, tau, are in the top half for both groups. So plasma markers are associated with neurodegeneration, but not clinical diagnosis. So again, we're finding some interesting differences. Now, this kind of shocks people, and it shocked me when we created it. We have not published this. This is still very small data. The sample size per modality is there, and so the tau scan numbers are pretty small. But what we just ATN positivity by race and ethnicity. And as you can see, the rates vary across all biomarkers, really. And look at that middle group. What we found was tau positivity is exponentially higher among Mexican Americans as compared to both other groups. And interestingly, there's this now emerging data and theory of vascular contributions to tau burden accumulation and progression. Well, given the increase, the metabolic things we've already discussed, we've already published previously, Mexican Americans have higher rates of white matter hyperintensity burden, so vascular burden. It's possible that we're seeing the sequence of these markers varying between groups. So neurodegeneration is obviously what we show younger. And so if you look at the normal Jack curves, our data does not fit with that. I would not say that A, T, and N aren't relevant. They are absolutely relevant. Our data very clearly shows that. But what we do see is the prevalence rates vary by race and ethnicity. And we also have data showing that the factors, demographic factors associated with these biomarkers, sociocultural, demographic, medical, vary by race and ethnicity, and the clinical impact and meaningfulness of these varies by race and ethnicity. So our conceptualization of Alzheimer's disease biologically and clinically is incredibly narrowly focused in one group. And what we're seeing is these things are all, markers are all important. They're all very relevant, but our conceptualization of what we think is, is the progression patterns, presentation, prevalence is just not true. Or not, I don't know that that's correct. It's that it doesn't necessarily equally apply across groups. And that's incredibly important because if we're going to start doing clinical trials, target enrollment of diverse populations into these trials targeting these markers, we really, really have a long way to go to understand exactly what we're doing with this. And so, I don't know exactly how to answer that yet, but that's the point of our study, is to look at these things longitudinally so that we can build appropriate interventions. So this is one that I put in here this is one example, but obviously we do a lot of plasma-based biomarkers. And one of the markers that people are so incredibly interested in right now, I mentioned earlier, is NFL. Plasma NFL has been linked to so many cognitive brain imaging outcomes, et cetera, and we've found the same thing. But the link, the expression levels, and the link with outcomes varies between groups. And so if you look on the right, the link between plasma NFL and meta ROI of neurodegeneration is actually stronger among Mexican Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites. But then if you go down, you see that it varies. It varies from ROI to ROI. Now, one of the other things about these plasma biomarkers, and that our cohort is now demonstrating, is not only do these things vary, these plasma amyloid, tau, NFL, whatever, there are oftentimes significant group differences. Now, that 12 months ago was probably, it was more of a theoretical and research question, but it's not a research question anymore because some of these markers are clinically already available. So there is plasma amyloid available as a blood test. I know of multiple companies currently trying to bring NFL and p-Taus to market. And so, okay, so there's now clinical implications for these things, but we're seeing pretty significant group differences. But one of the things that we were interested in, Michelle Milkey published this in Mayo's non-Hispanic white cohort, is what about these just medical comorbidities? Because these medical comorbidities vary pretty significantly between groups. And these medical comorbidities have drastic impacts on these plasma biomarkers, not small. These aren't trivial things. And so cut scores, interpretive guidelines, all have to take this into account. And so far, there's nothing about this available in terms of how would a clinician interpret these markers in light of this data. And so I have significant concerns with some of these things going to clinic prior to us actually knowing what they mean. Okay, so those are plasma-based and imaging-based ATN markers. So the whole point of our study is to understand the prevalence, progression, clinical impact of ATN-defined biomarkers across diverse populations within a sociocultural framework. So in my opinion, you cannot study Alzheimer's disease independent of the environment. And so this is one thing we've done is the area deprivation index. And many of you may know Amy Kind, Dr. Kind. She's the one that's been championing this, University of Wisconsin. And so what this is, it's a decile score, but the ADI is an aggregate measure of neighborhood level disadvantage. An ADI of 10 is most disadvantaged, and ADI of 1 is least disadvantaged. And then it's normally split into quintiles, which is what you see here on the screen. That graph, when I made it, was a bit shocking to me. Not surprising, it's just seeing it was one of those things that just really is eye-opening, scary, disappointing, and really, really important because it's a mirror image. So the percentages of Mexican Americans in highest deprivation areas is comparable to the percentage of non-Hispanic whites in the lowest deprivation areas. So there's very different patterns here, but look at the table. So then what we were curious about is let's match by ADI. So living in the same, these are census based. So these are living in the same geographic region. Living in the same geographic region does not mean equal access to things. So what you see is Mexican Americans in the lowest, least deprivation, areas of least deprivation, still have fewer years of education and a lower household annual income. Among the area, the greatest deprivation, non-Hispanic whites still have higher education and higher annual income. And so this understanding neighborhood level sociocultural factors, and not just these, is going to be of incredible importance. And we're expanding this work such that we will be capturing the ADI at primary residence for every decade of life. So 0 to 10, 10 to 20, what was your primary residence? We will do an ADI so we can look at this over the life course. But we're not only doing this with US-based residencies, we're also doing with those households from Mexico, because there is the index of marginalization that is already available from Mexico. We've already downloaded the data. And so 3 time points. So we will actually be able to do life course ADIs across Mexico to the United States, in the United States, migration patterns, et cetera. And we'll be able to examine how does this impact. ADI, we're not the first to do this, but basically greater levels of neighborhood deprivation is associated with poor cognition on any test you want to look at. It doesn't really matter what the test is. It's worse. So shifting gears a little bit. Many of you may be interested in functional outcomes, and there's a huge research looking at these functional outcomes, and functional outcomes are oftentimes in Alzheimer's trials. So one of the things we were interested in is how are these biomarkers associated with functional outcomes, and these are physical outcome measures. So tug is timed up and go, and it's a short portable physical battery. And ran the analyses. This is looking at white matter hyperintensity burden and neurodegeneration in the meta ROI that I mentioned. Statistically significant across the board. But then I said, okay, well, but let's split by not only ethnicity, but by cognitively impaired versus unimpaired. Because if you're doing a prevention versus an intervention study. What we found, as you see here, among non-Hispanic whites, it's white matter hyperintensity. These are all cognitively unimpaired individuals, by the way. So this is complete cognitively unimpaired for this one. And what you see is white matter hyperintensities are associated with almost all physical functional outcomes among non-Hispanic whites. Same thing among Mexican Americans. Neurodegeneration is associated with a couple of things for Mexican Americans, but when you get into cognitive impairment, the patterns change. White matter hyperintensity stays significant and neurodegeneration also is significant. And these models are run with both in the model. So that means neurodegeneration is significant with hyperintensities in the model. When you get to cognitively impaired among non-Hispanic whites, its neurodegeneration is associated with just total tug time, which is just like I said, time up and go. So these biomarkers that people are looking at with regards to cognitive outcomes, clinical cognitive outcomes, biomarker outcomes, these are also associated with physical functioning. And I don't think I have it in here, but we've also looked at this with plasma biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease, and we do find that these plasma biomarkers of amyloid, tau, and neurodegeneration are also associated with these physical functioning outcomes. So we need to think a little more broadly when we're considering some of these markers. So I added this today. Hopefully it's in a logical, organized manner, but this is something that I thought the group would be interested in. So the preclinical Alzheimer's cognitive composite, the PAC score, created by Michael Donahue at USC ATRI, was generated as a composite score specifically for clinical trials. This is the outcome for ACTC trials. So A4, the PACS, is primary outcome variable. It's not an average Z-score, it's a summed Z-score of these tests that are listed here. And we call it an HPAC in our study because we use the SEVLT delayed recall, whereas the original PAC used the free and queued selective reminding test. But we looked at it among cognitively unimpaired because we're just curious. All right, what does it look like among diverse populations? Because there's a huge push right now to diversify enrollment in clinical trials. And so our question was, is this score, is this summary measure even relevant? So the answer is yes. We found that you can, we can create an HPAC. It was significantly related to cortical thickness, hippocampal volume, neurodegeneration. These are cognitively unimpaired individuals. So it is related to the brain imaging outcomes that one would expect based on the prior literature and the whole point of creating the test in the first place. However, this is a theme, like I said, the link between hippocampal volume and PAC scores was stronger among non-Hispanic whites. And so we've seen that many of these biomarker links are actually stronger among non-Hispanic whites. Significantly associated with the plasma biomarker outcomes, again, the link stronger among non-Hispanic whites. And so this clinical instrument that's used in clinical trials is associated with the expected outcome biomarker outcomes. However, it's also strongly associated with ethnicity, and there's an ethnicity by ADI interaction on the association of this marker, this measure. And so a little bit of data to show you. And so as you can see, not a small sample size, 659 Mexican Americans, 669 non-Hispanic whites, all cognitively unimpaired. What you'll see if you get down here is HPAC, very significant difference in the score itself. Not an average Z-score, so you can't interpret this as a Z-score. But it's a sum z-score, but look at the difference between the two. And then when you split up between English and Spanish speaking Mexican Americans, you see another very significant difference. So it looks like almost 3 groups in terms of performance on this measure. But once you get to looking at the factors associated with the PAC outcome, this is you see here, there's the ADI by PACS graph, but look at the table up top: age, education, and ethnicity, and an ethnicity by ADI interaction. All right, so why is that? I think most of us would probably just assume that we're going to be the case, and that when you run analyses like this, you covary for these things. However, right now, the FDA does not support covarying for race or ethnicity in these sorts of models. So the people running the analyses for these models, I was on a Zoom yesterday with them and going through this data, and there's pretty significant implications for this. So if you're going to use the PAC score in a prevention trial, you're enrolling Hispanics and African Americans, we need to understand these things, because if we do not have the appropriate covariates in the model, we're going to find things that may or may not be significant and may not be even appropriate. But right now, the way the FDA has set up for the analytics for this, we will miss it. So this has to be addressed. But another thing that popped up here, which was interesting, is not unexpected, is the difference in MMSE scores. And so what you see is non-Hispanic white versus Mexican American on the top, but on the bottom you see within Mexican American split between English and Spanish speakers. So the PAC score, MMSE, is part of the score of the composite, but also MMSE scores are inclusion and exclusion criteria, oftentimes in clinical trials. What we talked about yesterday is when you look at the spread of scores of cognitively normal individuals, and Bernice Makopoulos published on this many years ago about average with education of 6, one at 17 is not abnormal for an MMSE score. Based on this, one could, there's a reason that I have a timer. One could exclude people who are appropriate for a prevention trial because they look cognitively impaired based on inclusion criteria with an MMSE score. So people that the FDA and others are trying to say, let's enroll, would be excluded because of just this one inclusion criteria. But also, based on this criteria, someone with a 16 or 17 and 0 years of education would meet inclusion criteria for a dementia study, but they're cognitively normal. And so this has implications for clinical trials that really need to be taken into account. And this data, the team's already, they're actually going to take this to the FDA to start having some more discussions about how to build the analytic models for these trials. So based on this data, we really have to question some of the FDA assumptions regarding clinical trials. Okay, so in conclusion, wrap it up a little bit, because just in case there are some questions, our conceptualization of Alzheimer's disease, just kind of when we picture it clinically or biomarker defined, is basically non-Hispanic white men. That's kind of what's there in women. The presence and factors associated with these biomarkers and the clinical impact of these biomarkers varies between racial and ethnic groups. And so, for example, even the PAC score was associated with hippocampal sclerosis, but the link was stronger among non-Hispanic whites, actually twice as strong. ApoE4 is associated with amyloid, but it's stronger among non-Hispanic whites. So ATN defined biomarkers, we must understand these across diverse populations if we're really going to start getting at novel precision medicine, population informed interventions and preventions. What I didn't show, but even the demographics data are differentially linked to amyloid, for example. Additionally, clinical, demographic, and sociocultural factors are associated with these biomarkers. There's a general assumption in many people in the field and even in the literature that sociocultural factors aren't associated with amyloid. Why would they be? Well, that's just wrong. And so we need to basically dig into this better, because sociocultural factors are associated with what we're seeing clinically. And I always say you can't parse out research from clinic. The whole point of all this is to help patients. So this is a research defined framework, but it impacts clinical trials and potentially clinical practice. Plasma biomarkers are also varying. And so basically my take home point is we can't continue to ignore studying these fundamental factors that we think are causally related to Alzheimer's. We can't just ignore the fact that we haven't studied this in diverse populations, and we need to better reflect our community at large. Finally, data sharing. As I said before, this data is all publicly available. Please take and use it. It's not my data. This is the community's data. And so the more people who use it, the more likely we're to help patients. So please download it, use it. If you want samples, different story, there's a different request for that, but data is reusable. It doesn't go anywhere. The raw scans are even available if you want to download and process the scans yourself. All of the scans are housed at Lonnie. The data is housed here, but at renewal, we'll actually be transitioning this over. We are funded already to do longitudinal examinations. If the renewal is funded, we will have up to 4 time points among Mexican Americans, non-Hispanic whites, 3 time points among African Americans, and then 2 time points among those same groups, but age 30 to 49. So there's a ton of data there, all available. So I'm going to stop there and take whatever questions you may have. No one's speaking now.
I have a question. Sid,
Sure.
Thank you so much, and congrats on all of this amazing work. And it's just, I learned so much today, and it makes me wish I had talked to you last year. We need to get together. Anyway, I'm going to start with one question, and then maybe we'll see if other people have questions, and I can come back to some other questions. But Bonnie, my postdoc, is on this call, and she had a question for me this morning that I thought you might be a really great person to ask. So we've got some data from the TALC longitudinal, cohort study that you know very well, and it's null findings. So she's asking me, hey, do you think people are going to be interested in differences no differences between non-Hispanic white and Hispanic? So what do you say? What do you think?
Absolutely. I think the lack of publication of null findings is one of the biggest problems we have in our field, because it's important to know what is significant as well as what's not, right? You can't know what something is unless you know what it is not. So I think that's very important. And sometimes those really point out and highlight differences between studies and study designs. So hi, Bonnie. Yeah, please publish that. I think it's very important.
Thanks.
Hello. I have more of a comment than a question. So I love the challenging of the temporal ordering of the Jack curves. I think I'm glad that we're kind of expanding our view of what that is supposed to be. And especially when it comes to these racially, ethnically diverse samples. I hadn't seen the findings about tau positivity rates being higher in the Mexican Americans. Do you think that's really vascular, and have you been able to actually tease that apart or look at the vascular contribution to that tau positivity?
I think, yeah, I think if that was a small sample size, if that finding continues to hold, I think that's what we will have to dig into is tau burden, is this true, right? Does it hold? And also, is it vascular, metabolic, and other things driving it? Because it wouldn't surprise me if this tau finding does continue to hold because of the younger onset of neurodegeneration. So I think that's what we will dig into. And one of the things, Allie, that we've proposed in the renewal is to actually expand the ATN framework itself. So our conceptualization is ATNVMI, vascular, metabolic, inflammatory. And then I'm looking at I've got whiteboards across my entire office, kind of like Steve Nash in here. But I actually have sociocultural as another component to the framework that I think needs to be added. So we're absolutely going to be testing these things because like neurodegeneration is not specific. Well, vascular metabolic won't be specific either, but it doesn't mean it's not very strongly associated with dementia, because I think now what we're seeing is if you say Alzheimer's framework only, you're missing a lot. Because if you say Alzheimer's is amyloid, well, 50% of the cases we say are dementia clinically like Alzheimer's are not Alzheimer's. So we must expand this framework and consider it a much more holistically and broad-based approach to really understand what's going on. Did I answer your question? I see, let's see, Mark, you had your hand up.
Yeah, this is a great talk. I was curious. I was looking quickly at some of the numbers in terms of like your prevalences of different characteristics for your subgroup populations. Mm-hmm. And they're different. They seem to be different than what we would see in large population level data like the health and retirement study. Mm-hmm. So I was curious whether you've benchmarked who's in your study with the large scale population studies. And they've also been looking at issues like dementia incidence, dementia life expectancy, how many years you live. They've been looking at race ethnicity, and they've broken the Hispanics down by foreign born and as an example. So I'm just curious, kind of since you're focused, your kind of take home messages we should pay attention to race ethnic differences in dementia, whether you've benchmarked your work to the larger population studies, which are nationally representative.
That's a really difficult thing to do. But that's one of the things that is built into our project is, so, this is a large scale study, 3,000, soon to be 4,500 participants, but it's small compared to large, full population reflective studies. But the larger studies can't do the phenotypic characterization we do.
That's right.
And, right. So that's one of the things we're explicitly built to do. And one of the goals of the renewal is to explicitly take our data and start benchmarking it and comparing it to numerous other studies. So health and retirement study, we're going to contribute to Amy Kind's neighborhood study, which goes across all ADCs. Yeah. We've got measurement overlap with Sol Inca, which has 15,000 people in it.
Right.
So we can go back and forth from study to study, find something that might be like in the health and retirement study. Maybe this is some subgroup or this is some marker associated with dementia among diverse populations. And we can take it back into our work and say, okay, is it now related to amyloid tau neurodegeneration, and kind of work back and forth. So that's the whole point of what we're trying to do. And there are much smarter people than me who will be doing those analytics, but we haven't done them yet. But if you look at, interestingly enough, if you look at our population so far, the average education, income, et cetera, of our Mexican American and non-Hispanic white is very comparable to larger scale large scale studies. And so we do have some confidence that our Mexican American cohort here in DFW in a lot of ways does look like the US Mexican American population, but we do have to do the things you're talking about to really better refine that and understand it.
Thanks.
Abbas?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great talk, and I very, very enjoyed that. So I have a couple of technical questions about your data sharing. So I've been using the ADME data, and I'm wondering how much your protocol, specifically imaging, is close to ADME. Mm-hmm. Have you ever had, I see that you have a 3-Tesla MRI, that's great. Have you ever used Preserve or other, to pre-process your T1 data? And then I see your DTI, whether you have the DTI And also the resting state of MRI have been showing that the network, brain network, is a great biomarker for early detection of the AD. I'm wondering if you have resting state of MRI or you have a plan in the future.
So our methods actually, one way or another, overlap with a ton of studies, including ADNI. So our MRI protocol is largely ADNI based. It's not completely aligned with ADNI 3. There are some minor differences. The DTI protocol is actually an improvement over Lonnie's. It's done by Yonggang Shi at Lonnie. And so I don't know if I said this, but obviously I said the scans are stored at Lonnie, but Lonnie also processes all of our scans. So we do have all of your standard structural markers in the database. We have DTI in there. We do actually have resting state scans. No one has actually examined any of those yet. So those are just scans sitting in the database. There's
more than happy to process that.
You're welcome to. There's several groups now starting to look at it. I mean, we have probably right now almost 4,000 MRIs in the database. And so if you want to process it, have at it. One thing for everyone to keep in mind, you can all download and process the scans. We will give you our imaging protocols. It's not yet posted on the webpage, but as Dr. Clark knows, we're in the process of giving them our actual scanning protocols. Anyone can process, reprocess, whatever. If you do, your new process data must also go back into the database and be publicly available to the community. If you get a grant to do that work, you get a time frame where it's your data. You don't have to share it immediately. But once you've published your primary publication or 12 months after completion, the data becomes available. So we do give the primary person a lead way, but the data must also be available to the community.
Good, thank you.
What other questions? I know we're running out of time. I think it's almost 11. Hey, Rob.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
So if it's not Alzheimer's disease, what is it? And is the neurodegeneration, the ATN piece of it, is that where vascular metabolic socioculture, is that where that belongs?
Right. I don't like Alzheimer's disease anymore. I think of it as Alzheimer's diseases from a clinical standpoint, because what we clinically think looks like Alzheimer's, the general notion previously before, that was one of the big surprises to the field, was that only 70 to 80% of patients seen in dementia clinic diagnosed with Alzheimer's had amyloid positivity. And I remember when that happened, and many of the field was like, oh my God, why? What in the world? These aren't Alzheimer's patients. Well, it's even less among diverse communities. So the way I view the framework is there should be mechanistic pathways. They may interact with one another. So exactly where the metabolic and inflammatory and vascular, I think when we're going to run these analyses, I think they have direct links with cognition and dementia risk. And I think they have indirect links with dementia and cognitive risk through probably amyloid tau and neurodegeneration. Probably the strongest would be neurodegeneration, would be my guess. But I think there's going to be direct and indirect pathways for these other factors, including sociocultural. And that's what the whole renewal is designed to study, is big picture is ATN, VMI, all within a sociocultural framework. And how does this impact the prevalence, progression, presentation, and clinical meaningfulness of these biomarkers?
Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, anybody else? Okay. Well, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. Like I said, I'm going to come down and see you guys at some point soon. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out. The link for I showed that, but you can easily go just UNTHSC ITR and find the webpage, and there's a data request. If you have questions, like I said, reach out. Your students are welcome to the data. We're supporting student projects, dissertations. We've now supported, I think we've had 3 or 4 R01s that have been supported by the project. K grants are being supported by the project. So, and one of the things we're very, very interested in doing is training the next generation of scientists, especially those from diverse communities. So if you have trainees that are interested in these sorts of things, get them linked to the data, get them linked to me. If I don't respond to your emails, just type KJ, please make him respond, and she will make sure I respond. So thank you so much. Y'all have a wonderful
for an excellent talk. We very much appreciate it. I have some questions, but we'll have a chance to talk tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to that. And just a reminder to everybody who's on the call, our next speaker just confirmed. So it's Dr. Okwanko, and he'll be joining us on April 20th at 10 a.m. So you'll start to see some notices coming out about that. But I just wanted to let you know since we got confirmation. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Dr. O'Brien, for a fantastic talk.
Thank you very much.
Have a good rest of your day, everybody.